A river at dawn. Quiet. Empty. Nothing to suggest what is about to happen here. 38 AD, the river is called Bach Dang. By sunset, it will be remembered for 1,000 years. 200 warships are sailing toward this exact stretch of water. Thousands of soldiers, the full weight of an empire. Waiting for them, hidden just beneath the surface, is a trap nobody has seen yet. To understand why, we have to go back, almost exactly 1,000 years back. In 111 BCE, the Han Empire conquered Vietnam and never let go. For the next 1,000 years, Vietnam was not a country. It was a province. Its taxes flowed north. Its governors were appointed from the Chinese capital. Its language, its customs, its identity were treated as something to be managed, not respected. Across those centuries, Vietnam rebelled again and again. Every single time, it was crushed. Then, in 907, something happened in the north that changed everything. The mighty Tang dynasty collapsed. China shattered into rival warring kingdoms. One of the new kingdoms, the Southern Han, inherited the old claim on Vietnam, and it fully intended to enforce that claim. But for one brief moment, Vietnam tasted something it hadn't felt in 1,000 years. Self-rule. A local general named Duong Dinh Nghe had pushed Chinese forces out and ruled in their place. For a few short years, it actually worked. Then, in 937, one of his own officers murdered him. The killer's name was Ngo Quyen. He seized power for himself, but he had just made an enemy he could not have imagined. His name was Ngo Quyen, and he was already writing to settle the score. Ngo Quyen was not a nobleman. He was a son-in-law, married into power, not born into it. He had served under Duong Dinh Nghe for years, fighting at his side, earning his trust completely. When the news of the murder reached him, he didn't hesitate. He gathered every soldier loyal to his father-in-law's memory and marched south. Ngo Quyen, the usurper, knew he could not win a fair fight, so he sent a desperate message north to the Southern Han court, begging for help. It was the same Southern Han king who had wanted to reconquer Vietnam all along. He saw his opportunity, and he took it immediately. He ordered his own son, Prince Liu Hongkao, to lead a massive invasion fleet south. 200 warships, the largest force Southern Han had ever sent overseas. Liu Hongkao would command it personally. But before that fleet could even leave port, Ngo Quyen had already reached the capital. Ngo Quyen never got the chance to be rescued. Within days, Ngo Quyen controlled the capital. The rebellion was over before it began. But word of the Southern Han fleet had already reached him too. 200 warships were already crossing the Gulf, heading straight for him. There was no army in Vietnam large enough to meet them at sea. If he fought them head-on, he would lose, completely. So he called his most trusted commanders together and asked them a different question. Not how do we beat them, but where can the river itself become our weapon? One commander mentioned something the others had almost forgotten. The tides on the Bach Dang River were unusually extreme, several meters, twice a day. Ngo Quyen went silent for a long moment. Then he smiled and said, "We are not going to fight their fleet. We are going to drown it." He explained his reasoning to the stunned commanders. The Chinese ships were built for the open sea. Deep hulls, heavy timber frames, built to survive ocean swells. That same design became a weakness in a narrow, shallow river. If the river could be made even shallower at exactly the wrong moment, those ships would become helpless. Vietnamese boats, by contrast, were small, light, and shallow-drafted. They could go almost anywhere on that river. The Chinese fleet could not. Ngo Quyen sent scouts to walk the riverbed at low tide, mapping every sandbar and channel. They found exactly what he was hoping for, a long, straight stretch where the main channel narrowed to barely more than a ship's width. If heavy ships were forced through there at the wrong moment, they would have nowhere to go. Ngo Quyen ordered every able-bodied villager nearby to report to the riverbank. He needed wood. thousands of pieces of it, and he needed it within days. Every household contributed, farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, all of them. Blacksmiths forged iron tips by the thousand, working day and night. Each tip was fitted onto a sharpened wooden stake, taller than a man. Within days, there were thousands of them, stacked along the riverbank. Ngo Quyen himself walked the lines, inspecting every batch. Now came the hardest part, getting them all into the riverbed, without anyone noticing. Southern Han scouts were known to patrol the coast. Any sign of activity could ruin everything, so the work would happen only at night, and only during the lowest tides. Hundreds of workers would have only a few hours each night to do it. Ngo Quyen raised a single torch. The work began. Workers waded into the cold mud, driving the first stakes deep into the riverbed, row after row, stake after stake, through the night. By the third night, the stakes stretched the entire width of the channel. Every stake was driven at a precise angle, designed to catch the hull of a ship riding low in the water. Then came the moment of greatest danger. The work had to finish before the very first hint of daylight. Just before dawn, the last stake was driven into place. Ngo Quyen ordered everyone off the riverbed immediately. Within the hour, the tide returned and swallowed the entire trap. From the surface, the river looked exactly as it always had. Nothing to suggest that beneath it lay a forest of iron teeth. Now, all that remained was to wait, and to make sure the Chinese fleet actually sailed into it. Word arrived. The Southern Han fleet had reached the coast. 200 warships, anchored just outside the river mouth, preparing to advance. Aboard the lead ship, Liu Hongtao gathered his captains for a final briefing. He expected this to be simple: a river, a rebel force, and an empire's army. He had no reason to expect anything else. No scout had reported anything unusual. The trap had worked exactly as Ngo Quyen intended, completely invisible. At dawn the next morning, the order came: advance up the river. 200 warships began moving into the mouth of the Bach Dang River, exactly where Ngo Quyen wanted them. But the trap alone was not enough. The Chinese fleet had to reach exactly the right spot at exactly the right time. That meant luring them in, not just waiting for them. Ngo Quyen had one more piece to the plan, and it required real soldiers to risk their lives as bait. He turned to his most trusted officer and gave the order himself. Provoke them, strike fast, then run and make it look real. The bait was ready. Now it just needed the fleet to take it. The fleet moved steadily upriver, deeper into Vietnamese territory. Liu Hongtao stood at the bow, watching the banks slide past in total silence. Then, ahead, a handful of small Vietnamese boats appeared from around a bend. They were laughably few, barely worth noticing against 200 warships. That was exactly the point. The Vietnamese boats surged forward and struck the lead ships without warning. Arrows arced across the water. Spears found their marks. For a moment, it genuinely looked like a real attack. Then, just as suddenly, the Vietnamese boats turned and fled upriver. On the Chinese ships, officers shouted in confusion. Was this a retreat or a trick? Liu Hongtao made his decision in seconds. Pursue them. Do not let them regroup. The entire Chinese fleet surged forward after the retreating boats. From his hidden position, Ngo Quyen watched the entire fleet take the bait. Every single ship was now committed to the chase, and the tide, at that exact moment, was at its highest point of the day. Every stake Ngo Quyen had planted was now hidden, harmlessly, just beneath the hulls. The Vietnamese boats led the fleet deeper and deeper into the narrow channel, right into the exact stretch the scouts had marked weeks earlier. Ngo Quyen raised his hand. The bait crews scattered to the riverbanks, out of danger. Now there was only one thing left to do: wait for the tide to turn. On the Chinese ships, nothing felt wrong yet, but the water around them had already begun, almost imperceptibly, to fall. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The Chinese fleet pressed on, deeper into the trap. Then, somewhere in the middle of the formation, a strange sound rose from beneath one of the hulls. A groan of wood under pressure it was never built for. A sailor leaned over the side, trying to understand what he was hearing. What he saw made his blood run cold. A row of sharpened iron points rising slowly out of the water around the hull. He shouted a warning, too late for the ship beneath him. The hull caught against the first stake with a violent jolt. Then a second stake, then a third. The ship was no longer moving. All along the channel, other captains felt the same sickening drag beneath their ships. One by one, the heavy warships ground to a halt, snagged on a forest no one could see. Aboard the lead ship, Lu Hongzhou felt his own vessel lurch violently beneath him. He rushed to the side and looked down into the water. What he saw confirmed his worst fear. The river itself had been turned into a weapon, and the tide was still falling. There was no way to turn around. The ships behind blocked any retreat. There was no way forward either. The channel ahead was just as full of stakes. 200 warships, the pride of an empire, were now trapped in place. From the riverbank, Ngo Quyen watched it all unfold, exactly as he had planned. He raised his sword. Now, hidden along both riverbanks, hundreds of Vietnamese soldiers rose at once. Drums began to beat. War horns sounded across the water. The counterattack had begun. Vietnamese boats closed the distance in seconds, light and fast against the stranded giants. Grappling hooks flew through the air and caught on the railings of the stalled ships. Vietnamese warriors climbed the hulls hand over hand, blades drawn. On the Chinese decks, chaos took over. Soldiers who had trained for open battle found themselves fighting on a tilting, sinking platform. Some ships were boarded from 3 sides at once. Others were simply abandoned, crews leaping into the water and swimming for the banks. The Vietnamese forces, who had been hiding along both banks, now poured into the water themselves, cutting off any escape. Lu Hongzhou tried to rally his remaining men aboard his flagship. For a moment, it looked like discipline might hold the line. Then a second wave of Vietnamese boats arrived, and the line broke completely. Lu Hongzhou found himself surrounded on his own deck, his honor guard falling one by one around him. He raised his sword for what would be the last time. Across the river, ship after ship fell silent, one by one. What had been the proudest fleet in the Southern Han Navy was now a graveyard of broken hulls. Of the 200 ships that had entered the river that morning, more than half would never leave it. Thousands of Southern Han soldiers were dead, captured, or drowned. Lu Hongzhou did not survive the battle. What had begun that morning as the largest invasion fleet Southern Han had ever launched ended that same afternoon in complete annihilation. On the riverbank, Ngo Quyen lowered his sword. It had taken less than a single day. What survived of the Southern Han fleet turned and fled back toward the open sea. They would not return. Vietnam, for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, stood completely free of foreign armies. News of the disaster reached the Southern Han capital weeks later. The king, who had so eagerly seized his opportunity, now faced the cost of it. His son was dead. Half his invasion fleet was destroyed. Thousands of his best soldiers were gone. Any plans to reconquer Vietnam died with that fleet at the bottom of the Bach Dang River. Southern Han would never again seriously attempt to retake the South. In Vietnam, meanwhile, the victory changed everything almost overnight. The man who had defeated an empire's navy in a single afternoon was now the undisputed leader of his people. In 939, Ngo Quyen did something no Vietnamese leader had done in nearly 1,000 years. He declared himself king, and Vietnam an independent nation. Not a province, not a tributary, a kingdom in its own right. He established his capital at Co Loa, the ancient seat of Vietnamese kings centuries before Chinese rule began. It was a deliberate choice, a direct link back to a Vietnam that existed long before any of this began. For the first time in a millennium, Vietnam answered to no one but itself. But Ngo Quyen's reign would be short. He died only 6 years later, in 944. What followed his death was a period of internal conflict, as Vietnamese lords struggled for power. But the one thing none of them ever questioned was Vietnam's independence itself. The door Ngo Quyen had kicked open at Bach Dang never closed again. For the next 9 centuries, despite invasions, despite occupations, Vietnam never again fully lost itself to China. Historians still point to the Battle of Bach Dang as the true birth of Vietnamese statehood. Not the moment Vietnam was born, but the moment it finally proved it could stay free. And it all came down to one tactical decision: read the ground better than your enemy does. Ngo Quyen didn't have more ships. He didn't have more soldiers. He simply understood one stretch of river better than anyone alive. And he was willing to spend weeks preparing for a battle that would last only a few hours. Military historians have compared Ngo Quyen's tactic to other famous ambushes throughout history. The most famous comparison is the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where Hannibal lured Roman legions into a collapsing trap. But Hannibal commanded veteran soldiers who had trained for years under his banner. Ngo Quyen built his trap with farmers, fishermen, and blacksmiths who had never fought a naval battle in their lives. What he had instead of veterans was patience, secrecy, and an intimate knowledge of his own land. He understood something that many commanders, ancient and modern, still fail to grasp. You don't have to be stronger than your enemy. You only have to choose the battlefield. The tide that doomed the Southern Han fleet was the same tide that rose and fell every single day, for centuries before the battle and centuries after. It took one man looking at it differently to turn an ordinary tide into a weapon. Today, the Battle of Bach Dang is studied across military academies in Asia, not as legend, but as engineering. The lesson is rarely about the stakes themselves. It's about timing, about reading the rhythm of something everyone else takes for granted. A river doesn't care who wins a war, but it will absolutely decide who does. 200 warships could not outfight a force 1/10 their size, because the fight had already been decided before a single arrow was fired. It was decided weeks earlier, in the mud, in the dark, with mallets and iron tips. That is the part the headlines never capture, the unglamorous work behind the legendary outcome. Ngo Quyen is remembered today as one of Vietnam's most important historical figures. Streets, schools, and warships still carry his name, but the river itself remains his truest monument. Even now, archaeologists occasionally pull blackened wooden stake fragments from the riverbed, preserved for nearly 11 centuries underwater. Some of those original stakes are now preserved in a museum near the river itself. Visitors can stand within arm's reach of the very weapon that ended 1,000 years of foreign rule. The Bach Dang River still flows through northern Vietnam today, much as it did in 938. The tides still rise and fall, exactly as they always have. Fishermen cast their nets in waters that once swallowed an empire's navy. Most of them have no idea they are fishing in one of the most consequential battle sites in Vietnamese history. And maybe that's fitting. Ngo Quyen didn't fight for monuments. He fought so that an ordinary morning like this one could simply exist, undisturbed, in a free country. 11 centuries later, that morning is still happening, every single day. Every empire that has ever tried to expand by force has eventually run into someone like Ngo Quyen, someone with less power, fewer resources, and a far better understanding of the ground they were standing on. That is the pattern that runs through almost every great upset in military history. Not luck, not numbers, geography, timing, and the willingness to wait. Bach Dang is simply one of the clearest examples ever recorded. 200 warships, an empire's full ambition, undone by sharpened wood and an unremarkable tide. If there is one lesson worth carrying away from this story, it might be this. The most dangerous trap is never the one you can see coming. It's the one hiding in something you walk past every single day without a second thought. For Liu Hongkao, it was a river he had never seen before. For Ngo Quyen, it was the same river he had known his entire life. That difference, in the end, was the whole battle. This is far from the only time a battlefield like this decided the fate of an empire. Across Asia, for thousands of years, terrain has quietly determined outcomes that armies alone never could. Mountain passes, monsoon seasons, rivers exactly like this one. Each one a story most people outside the region have simply never heard. That is exactly what this channel exists to change. If this kind of tactical breakdown is your thing, subscribe. There is a great deal more like it coming. Every battle covered here follows the same standard. Real history, real consequences, told properly. Next time, we go further west, into a kingdom most people have never even heard of. A king who never lost a battle, and still lost his entire empire. Until then, the Bach Dang River keeps flowing, exactly as it has for over 1,000 years. Quiet, unassuming, and once, for a single afternoon, the most dangerous place on Earth. Thanks for watching.